So going into this meeting, you're going to want to figure out their timeline, where they currently are in the process, and what types of questions they already have in mind. If they're thinking about buying a home, they've probably been perusing online, or they're in the very, very early stages and they're looking for guidance. I like to educate and show that I'm going to lead them through this process. With consumers having a ton of information at their fingertips, a lot of buyers think they know everything, which is why it's really important to state what you bring to a transaction and why it's valuable to have a buyer's agent, especially with shifting market inventory and also just the general preconception of what agents do. It's not just opening a door, and you have to tell them what you do in addition to that, because again, you have to kind of move beyond the stereotypes and mindset that's already out there. So when I sit down, I've got a buyer's guide. The most important part of that is going to be the roadmap to success, which is essentially each step in the transaction. And this is very, very helpful as a point of reference when you're explaining to a client. Again, they're going to have questions throughout it, and you can kind of bring them back to that pathway. Say, okay, so the next step, you feel comfortable there? Do you have any more questions? Great, let's move on. And again, that's their resource to look back on. And you can dumb it down to your whole transaction takes between 30 to 45 days typically. This is why. Your inspection period, your appraisal period, your mortgage contingency period, and then getting that file closed and getting your clear to close. And laying it all out like that makes a lot more sense. And then you can explain how you can possibly speed up that process, how you might be able to offer a 21-day closing if you get pre-underwritten, and all of those other details that naturally kind of just come along with the process. But to start, I'll say, okay, we're sitting here today doing the buyer's consultation or a buyer strategy meeting. This is the first step to the process. And I have it in my guide of this is just expected. Along the way, your very first step is to sit down with a real estate professional and to learn, because this is a really big financial decision in your life. Would you go into this unprepared? Even if you're buying a car or any sort of something, you've done research on it. And this is the time to learn and do that research. So the first step, we're doing it now. This is great. And the next step now, I never like to assume that somebody's going to be needing a pre-approval. If you're working with a cash buyer who has $500,000, $800,000 handy to purchase a home, it's almost a little bit insulting to assume that they're going to need financing. And then you also don't want to neglect your financed buyers, because that's going to be a huge majority of probably who you're working with. So I'll phrase it as a question. Is this going to be a cash purchase, or are you going to be financing? And then if somebody's like, well, this would be cash purchase, that's fantastic, great. At the time of offering, we're going to need some sort of proof of funds to show that you have that available. Sometimes, depending on the price point, you might need that in order to actually book a showing appointment to make sure you're a qualified buyer. For the pre-approval, I'll set the expectation that that's needed in order to view homes. How many times have we heard, oh, we're just waiting to find the right house and then we'll get pre-approved? And you're like, okay, well, that sounds extremely stressful and not like it's in your best interest. So educating on the expectations of when and how something should be done is going to be really, really important. So I state that the first step after having a buyer strategy meeting is going to be getting that pre-approval started if they are getting financing. And what that looks like, I'll ask about, hey, have you started that process yet? And somebody might come back and say, oh, I've talked to my local bank, or I went online and I found a quick 5-minute pre-approval, and I want to educate on that now. I'm not necessarily saying, hey, that was the wrong step. I'll say, hey, that's really good to see you're taking that initiative and starting the process. Really great job. You always want to award and reward somebody for doing the right steps and the right things. Great, sounds like you're looking to get educated. I'm so glad you reached out to me. That's really the first step, is figuring out what you're missing and what you have an idea of already. In terms of the pre-approval, if somebody mentions talking to a local bank, I'll say, hey, that's great. Oftentimes, if you're a part of a credit union, that'd probably be the one example where you might get the benefits of working with a local bank. Beyond that, working with an outside lender that's able to shop around different programs and rates will likely give you a better opportunity, because many small banks are limited to what types of programs and rates they have available. If you'd like, and then again, I always at the end of any recommendation am going to repeat and reiterate that of course you are able to use whoever you'd like. Do you have a trusted mortgage professional that you've either worked with before or have a strong relationship with? Rather than stating, hey, have you had that conversation? I want to know, do you have a strong working relationship with this person already? And if they're like, well, we had one phone call, or here's the person my family's been using for 10 years. I'll say, great, that sounds like they have a personal interest in making sure this transaction goes well. I get nothing out of referring my preferred lender. I just know they do a really good job for my clients, and they're going to answer the phone past 5 o'clock and on weekends, which is when a lot of real estate happens. And they're also going to make sure they do a really good job because they want to earn my business in the future. It's a little bit of a humble brag moment, but you're also, again, you're sitting there as the authority and leader in that room and meeting. So stating that, yes, this other real estate professional wants to continue to earn my business makes it sound like I do a lot of business and that I'm somebody worth working with. From there, I'll send a connecting text or email, depending on what my client that I'm sitting in front of prefers, contact-wise. Having that warm connection rather than just passing off a phone number for them to play phone tag with multiple times gets confusing. I'll also say, hey, what's the best time for them to reach out to you? They're on the phone a lot during the day, going back and forth. Sometimes it's easier to just throw out a couple time frames that work best for you. Is it lunchtime between 12:30 to 1:30? Is it after the kids go to bed? Is it on weekends? And in that email to my preferred lender, I'll say, hey Danielle, I have so-and-so connected here with us. I'll give a couple sentences of their background. They're looking to buy by the end of the summer. They got a quick pre-approval online. They're thinking they're gonna fall in this range. They're looking in these towns for this type of property. Give them a little bit of information so that when they get on the phone together, it's not just a cold conversation. They've got a little bit of an idea of what they're getting into. And then I'll say, here's their cell number. They're available between these times, and that's the best time to reach out. Let me know if I can do anything in the meantime. I'll wait to hear from you. And any preferred lender or preferred partner that I work with, I know follows up probably better than I do. And that's what you want. So they're gonna be reaching out, making that connection, working through that pre-approval process. What I'll do is I'll educate the person I'm talking to and say, hey, that's probably gonna be starting with an application. So the first step once you get in touch with a lender is going to be going through that application. It takes about 15 to 20 minutes to fill out. It's gonna ask a lot of questions. That way when you guys get on the phone together, you're able to have a really effective conversation and figure out what the best loan products or timeline. If you're talking to somebody that thinks they're not going to be able to buy for 6 months to a year, I'll still talk up getting them connected to my preferred partner sooner rather than later. If somebody's worried about their credit or financial situation, the debts they have to pay off, having a conversation with a lender 6 months or a year out can be even more beneficial because that lender is the one who's figuring out what you need to do to be able to be approved. So they can give guidance on how to build credit, what debts need to be paid off, how much money you're going to need to save for a down payment, and all of the above. So educating earlier, you're now front of mind throughout the next 6 months to a year when they're sitting back getting ready to buy, rather than hoping that they call you 8 months down the road when you're not quite front of mind and maybe you haven't reached out to them for a little bit of time. So building that connection as early on as possible is going to be really important. After I've kind of gone through that process, I'll say, okay, so once you've gotten that pre-approval, that's going to be the next step. We're going to get out there and see homes. I've got a really good idea of what you were looking for. You're going to bring in tidbits throughout this whole buyer strategy meeting of conversations you've already had. If this is somebody from your sphere, even just an acquaintance. If it's an online lead, you've probably had maybe a 20-minute conversation and not a ton of information to share. But what I'll say is, hey, so remember, I'll tie back in and reiterate that they're looking for a 4-bedroom home with a large entertaining space, preferably a pool. Sidewalks on the street would be preferable. I'm going to solidify the fact that I was listening when they were sharing personal information with me before. So by tying that back to our previous conversations, they know that they don't have to repeat themselves and that we're just building upon what we've already talked about. Once we're out looking at homes, great, that's the fun part. This is not all doom and gloom. This is a pleasant conversation about a really fun transition in their life. We're going to get out there, see homes. Ideally, we find one you love, and then from there, we're going to submit an offer. And you probably have an idea of how that goes. If you had friends or family buy, you've got inspections, appraisal, and all those steps. But let's talk about what actually happens first, and in what order, and what's important about each step, and how we can make each term in an offer as strong as possible. We have a lot of knowledge as real estate professionals, and sometimes we assume that other people have that knowledge also. So it's important to realize that a potential buyer doesn't necessarily know what a CMA is, and they don't know who an appraiser is or what they do. So stating each step along the way, what something is, why it's important, and how we can strengthen that term in an offer is going to be the whole purpose of this meeting. So education, importance, and action. So through this, the first step is going to be submitting an offer. If people are used to buying in different states or just uneducated about the process because they've been renting, I like to reiterate the fact that an offer is actually a filled out contract. Sometimes it sounds like a separate document, and in many states it is a separate document. So you're going to personalize this depending on where you're doing business. But in Connecticut, the contract is filled out, ideally to what the seller is looking for. And we send that over and we say, hey seller, please sign this. And at that time, a seller can either counter certain terms, go back and forth a little bit. That's all done verbally. I like to set expectations of how that's going to go. Are we re-signing documents if something little has changed or going back and forth? Nope, so we could verbally go back and forth, and then once we've come to an agreement, we can re-sign a fresh, clean document or possibly make an addendum to what we've already have signed. From there, you have 3 days to get your earnest money over to either the listing brokerage or attorney. That's what's going to make that contract legally binding. So at this whole time, again, I'm setting expectations because I'm leading how this transaction is going to go. Yes, you have 3 days to get that deposit over, but no seller wants to wait until the last third day to wait for that deposit to come in. So I set the expectations that as soon as we are under contract, that deposit is going to be immediately sent over because we want to make sure this is legally binding as soon as possible. That could be a personal check for a first deposit. Sometimes a brokerage will accept wire funds. If you're out of state, overnighting, this is not something that's sent snail mail because it has to be received or they have an opportunity to back out of the agreement. So setting expectations of this is something you're going to have to do immediately, and these are funds you're going to need immediately. Very often people think they don't need funds until the actual closing date. So setting expectations of what are out-of-pocket costs and what are immediately needed costs upon getting under contract. Again, you're educating. So from there, we're under contract. Amazing. Now, the first step to that process, if you are doing inspections, is a period of time you've selected on the contract to have inspections completed. In previous markets, we've seen this be between 7 to 14 days. Right now, I'm doing for my clients 2 to 4 days. And if you think about this entire process, the way to make an offer as strong as possible is to make it as appealing to the seller as possible. And what does a seller want? They want to accept a deal that has the least chance of falling apart. They're packing, they're moving, they're planning their next steps, which is why an offer without inspections is appealing. It's not that a seller is hiding information or covering up issues. They just don't want to worry about a chance for the deal to fall apart. If you are doing inspections, you have this period of time to have them done. Do you think a seller wants to wait 2 weeks to figure out if you're actually going to be moving forward with the deal or not? Or would you think that 2 to 3 days sounds a whole lot more enticing? I will schedule and pencil in that inspection with a preferred inspector, or if my client has somebody they would like to use, I will text that inspector, say, hey, I'm submitting a really strong offer. Can you put us on the schedule for this date? That way, when I'm submitting that offer in my email template of what that offer includes, I'm stating that I already have inspections tentatively scheduled. Let's make this happen. I'm ensuring that this is going to be a smooth process for the seller and also the listing agent. Inspections. Now, again, we're talking about what are they? This is a huge point that you must educate potential clients about. They have their preconceived notions, friends, family, they're just assumptions about what this is. And here's how I explain it. So, an inspector is somebody who knows a little bit about a lot of things. They're not necessarily a licensed electrician, a licensed plumber, or even a licensed contractor. They have a lot of education about houses and current building codes, and they're there to educate you and kind of go through the home, explain how it works, and point out what they are able to see. If there's a finished basement, they're not able to offer guidance on the walls behind those finished interior walls. They're only able to give guidance on what they can readily see. So when we're at a showing, I'm going to be going around and giving you as much education upfront about how the home works, all the way from the roof to the mechanicals to the fence in the backyard. So you should go into that inspection process with as much education as possible to start. Now that inspector is going to be covering their interests. So they're going to note absolutely everything that could be wrong with this house. If there's a crack in the driveway, they're going to write tripping hazard. If there's a rip in the second floor screen, they're going to note that. If a door doesn't close just right, they're going to note that as well. So what I'm doing is I'm telling my clients you're going to get a report that very possibly is 40 to 60 pages long. If a buyer's not expecting a 40-page report, it's probably going to be very, very overwhelming once they get it. And preparing them for what's going to be on that report at the showing, like, hey, we see this here. This is actually not to current building standards, so an inspector is going to note it. I see this in a lot of homes that I go into. It's not necessarily something you're going to have to tackle right away, but again, that inspector is kind of giving you a maintenance list along with safety and structural concerns, which is really the whole goal of an inspection, to make sure the home you're buying is safe and structurally sound. And then from there, depending on the market conditions that you're in, your ability to negotiate is going to be left to that fact alone. If there are multiple offers and you send over a nitpicky list, seller's probably just going to move on to a backup offer. If you're the only offer, you have a lot more leverage to possibly ask for something of high concern. If it's all minor nitpicky items and you send over a list of 25 requests, again, you're kind of personally offending the seller in a way too, if it's unreasonable. Even if there are a few things that you'd like done, I usually advise my clients, let's focus on the things that are actually going to be expensive or structurally safety concerns. So you might end up with picking your one or two things to possibly negotiate as for a credit or repair. In a scenario where a seller is selling their house, do you think they're going to hire the most expensive qualified professional to complete a repair? Probably not. Very, very, very few select people will be choosing that high expense contractor to complete something to get the deal to move forward. I generally advise my clients, if there is something you'd like done, let's get a professional quote, and from there, it's probably better that we ask for a credit. So you can choose your licensed professional and not worry about getting somebody in there and scheduling and checking up on that. I'd rather have the money personally, because what if you end up finding a cheaper contractor? What if it's something you actually want to tackle yourself because you're handy? And then from there, you're able to kind of have a little bit more flexibility with how you handle the situation. If a seller has multiple offers in a seller's market, we're very likely going to see no inspections or creative inspection terms. Waiving inspections is a hot topic in a seller's market. You have clients who are happy to do so because they're handy or licensed contractors themselves and they understand what goes on with the working of a home. And then you have first-time home buyers that were told by their parents and friends to absolutely not waive inspections. You're going to walk into a nightmare because their friend had this happen and XYZ. So I generally like to feel out how the person I'm talking to feels about this situation. Like, hey, have you heard that this is something that's going on? And if they come back with absolutely not, we're definitely not doing that, totally understand. It's something that a lot of buyers have, general fear of. And I like to just educate on the process of these are the types of things that are going to come up in an inspection. I give a little bit about my background, personally renovated properties, and have a lot of background and knowledge about the situation myself. So these are the types of things that come up. Would you not buy the house if you need to update the water heater and spend $1,500, $2,500 on an update like that? If you need to have the roof done and you need to have a $10,000, $15,000 cost, would you not buy the house because of that? If it turns out that there's a high level of radon, the home inspector leaves a monitor in the lowest portion of the house and it tests the quality for 48 hours. The ideal level is below 4.0. Realistically, if it does come up in an inspection report that there is a high level of radon, the solution to that is essentially a fan to help circulate the air from the lowest portion of the house. They're going to drill a hole and install a pipe that has a small motor with a fan in it. And it sounds like a really big, scary issue, and if you've done research or if you go on Google and you look up radon, it sounds really scary. And essentially, it's the breakdown of uranium in the earth. So you might have a house that has it, and right down the street, that other house doesn't. It totally depends. You could have it come up 5 years after owning a property. It's just something you want to keep up with and maintain. If you do have to install a system, that's going to run between $900, $1,500. So I'm kind of getting ahead of a few of the most common things that come up in inspections, and I'm educating on what that actually looks like. This way, when they get that report in front of them, it's not overwhelming and they have an idea of what to expect, and I can touch on, hey, so yep, this is what I mentioned during the inspection, or this is what they disclosed on the disclosures. The roof is older, that's why it's priced the way it is. If something is older, that's not really a point to negotiate on. You already have an understanding when you offered that when you went through the showing, the furnace was really old. So yeah, of course the inspection is going to say, hey, furnace is old. Think of it like an older car. They're simpler to fix, cheaper, and you usually just kind of maintain it until it goes. It's not necessarily something you have to immediately rip out the day after closing. So giving some examples, educating on what type of things are actual issues before we get to that point and they've got that report they're sharing with family and friends and getting outside advice on. I'll educate on what the wording on an inspection report looks like. It'll say recommend further evaluation by a licensed professional. Because again, that home inspector is not necessarily a licensed professional, so they can't state in writing without a fact this is the issue. In person, they can kind of candidly say this is what they see all the time, and these are the types of repairs and solutions to the issue you're looking at, and they can kind of give you an idea if it's serious or not, or more of a maintenance item. Regardless, through the inspection process, I'm educating as much as I can ahead of time. If we're in a situation where somebody's really set on still having inspections, but we're in a hot seller's market where a lot of people are waiving inspections, great. I will never tell somebody not to get inspections done. The reality is there are people who are waiving them. So how can we become more competitive and get at least up to par slightly with those other competing offers? There are inspecting companies who can come out to a showing with you. Think of that as having a really educated friend along for your showing. You're not going to get a written report. You're not going to have a full inspection because they probably only have an hour or so. But they might be able to at least look at those large ticket items, mechanicals, and general functioning of the house, which could have costly repairs. And that might make you more comfortable to be able to waive inspections on the paper that a seller is seeing. The next option, you could offer to set a threshold. In conversation, I'm giving these examples and I'm feeling out where a client is comfortable. If you had to replace a water heater, would that mean you're not going to buy the house? And if they tell me no, I'm like, okay, what if there are a couple things like that? If you're not buying a new construction home, there are always going to be to-do items. So where are you comfortable? And how much money have you set aside for when you do move in to have that to-do list handy? And once I have an idea of where they're actually comfortable, if they're outright telling me, hey, we just want to make sure that the house is not going to fall over. Okay. So are you interested in only having a foundation inspection done then? Because that's possible. You don't need to do termite, radon, mold, asbestos. If you're concerned about the foundation, then let's look at the foundation. And that at least is a whole lot better than checking off every single inspection on a contract. You could set a threshold of what you're comfortable with. Buyer will not back out, ask for any credit or repair for any single line home inspection item that comes up valued under $2,000. $5,000, $10,000. Where is your client comfortable? At least you're telling the seller ahead of time, we're not going to be nitpicky. And there's already that term floating around, as is, which in my personal opinion means nothing. It's a very loose promise to the seller that you're not going to ask for repairs or credits, but it doesn't actually hold you to that promise. It's very, very loose. And again, a seller is looking for a deal that has the least chance of falling apart. And especially in a seller's market, a lot of people are going to be including as is in their offers without actually understanding what it means. You're just saying, hey, I probably won't be nitpicky. Once you're under contract and you have that inspection report back, you can still send a list of requests and you can still back out for any reason. You could back out because you found a different property that you like more. So it doesn't actually give any reassurance to the seller that the deal's not going to fall apart. But if you set that threshold of, this is where I'm comfortable, I promise I'm locked into the deal, unless something beyond this comes up, then that's a whole lot better than having just regular inspections, and also far better than just as is. How a listing agent is going to explain as is to their seller can come into play here. I'm going to be talking to the listing agent from as soon as I schedule that inspection, all the way up until my offer is sent, and then from there following up on that. I'm constantly building a relationship. I'm going to first ask the listing agent, are there any terms that your seller is looking for? I want to know how this agent has educated their seller. Because if they don't understand that as is does not mean what it actually is assumed to mean, and they're telling their seller that as is the best thing, and that's the most concrete term you can have in an offer, I probably want to include as is, because that's what the seller has been educated on. If that listing agent agrees that, yeah, it doesn't really mean that much, in conversation, I want to have a clue of what that is. If they on the phone flat out tell me, hey, the seller's looking for no inspections, I'm now going to relay that to my clients of where their expectations lie. I'll follow up before a deadline, even after I've submitted an offer, and ask questions on, hey, are you able to share? Do the other offers that you have in hand, do they have inspections? Are they as is? And if you ask specific questions rather than just saying, hey, is my client's offer in the running? They're probably going to be far more likely to engage with you and give you more information. And I'm very good at getting agents to overshare when you ask those kind of leading questions, because it's not just about what they tell you, it's how they phrase it and what type of information they're purposely leaving out and where they're kind of hesitating to respond. So reading the room over the phone, essentially. Making your offer terms as concrete as possible when it comes to inspections is so important, because it's a huge point where sellers are thinking that things aren't going to go well, or if they're really confident in their home's structural integrity and safety, all of that, they're probably not so concerned. But realistically, having a short period of time and so much education to your clients, this is going to help the whole process go smoother. On the phone with the listing agent, I will explain how I've educated my clients. I've told them that, yep, we see on the disclosures that the roof is older, and unless it's actively leaking, this is not something they're going to have a point to negotiate with. They also noticed that the windows are older, or they saw that the furnace mechanicals are all updated. They're not expecting any concerns. I've educated them on all the other things that could come up, and they understand that it's likely not going to be something that's going to affect their process in moving forward. The set listing agent now thinks, okay, cool, we're not going and dealing with these really uneducated first-time home buyers. My seller's going to have a pretty good time. Now, after the inspection process, people typically wait to order the appraisal, and that's because both the inspection and the appraisal are out-of-pocket costs. How much does an inspection cost? I'll base it off of roughly what size home my client is looking for. If they're looking for a 2,500 square foot house, 4 bedrooms, I'll say, hey, your inspection will probably range between $600, $700. Radon inspection is around $125, $150. Mold, asbestos, all of those things. Realistically, the most common inspections that I see my client opt for are a general home inspection, radon, and termite and wood destroying insect, which is again another $150 to $200, and that's scheduled by the home inspector. So I'm explaining what the inspections are, who's completing them, how much they cost, and what to expect, and how we can strengthen that in their offer, which sounds like a lot of information, which you'd probably get to eventually. But if they've at least heard this before, when you're in that scenario, it's going to be so much easier to bring up what you've talked about. And you never want to be in a situation where you have a client just checking off boxes on a contract and they don't understand what they're checking off. So if you're educating, what does a radon inspection look like? And what does a termite or wood destroying insect inspection look like? I explain that it's a guy going around with a metal stick, poking and looking at the beams that they can see in the basement. If it's a fully finished basement, all they're looking for is evidence of tunneling and pest evidence throughout the property around the foundation, but they can't actually see any of the beams. And I'll educate on what that looks like cost-wise. So let's say that you do have termites. The reason people jump to thinking that's a really expensive fix is if there's existing damage and the house needs to be jacked up and beams need to be replaced, and that could be very costly. If it's just a matter of treating for a few insects that are present, we're in a wooded area, very common to have. The actual cost of the treatment is going to be reflected by the footprint of the house. From there, that's guaranteed for 3 years. It's usually good for about 5. That could range between $800 to $2,000. Would you not buy the house because you have to pay $1,000 for something that's going to last 3 to 5 years? Again, we're educating upfront, because otherwise they hear termites at the house and they think the absolute worst based off of their limited information about the topic. So I move past that. Once I feel like I've answered all their questions, I'll ask if they have any questions at the end of each of these stages. They have an idea of that's an out-of-pocket cost they're going to need to have funds available for to pay the day of the inspection. And then from there, we order the appraisal. Again, what is an appraisal? This is a third party who's hired by the bank providing you a loan. They're coming out to the property to offer an unbiased opinion of value. Why is this important? The bank is protecting their investment of giving you a loan. And I'll give an example of numbers. They don't want to lend you $800,000 on a property that's only worth $600,000. So they're not hired directly by the lender. They're not hired directly by me. We're honestly just hoping that we get somebody who's educated about the local market coming out to give us an unbiased valuation of the property. How do they do that? I've actually been trained by a licensed appraiser in the similar process they use to value properties. And what they do is to look at recent sales that are as similar to the property you're looking at as possible. Similar condition, size, style. Ideally sold within the last 3 months. You're hoping to find as similar as possible because you're not trying to make a ton of adjustments and get a property that's really, really different. You're not going to compare a log cabin to a raised ranch. You're just reaching a totally different buyer audience. After they've completed that valuation, the ideal goal is that the number that they determine matches up to your contract price. And going into the offering process, I complete a market valuation, this similar process before you even offer. Otherwise, we're just picking an offer number out of thin air based roughly off of our knowledge of the market. I'm going through giving you an idea of, hey, this is where the home is valued based off of recent sales. If we're in a competitive market, you're likely going to have to pay what a home is worth and then some to actually get your offer accepted. Right there, I'm setting the expectation to get an offer accepted. You have to be competitive in terms of pricing. If you set the expectation that they're only having to pay what a home is worth, and you're in a hot seller's market and you're looking at recently sold data in the rearview mirror from 3 months ago, and we're in an increasing market, you're setting your clients up for failure because they're not prepared to do what they need to in order to get their offer accepted. So I'm setting the expectation that they're going to have to be aggressive, prepared in every single aspect, and it's not just about price. And I'll make the example, again, I like to use specific numbers for the range that they're looking in, and I'll make numbers that are drastic enough where it keeps their attention. So I'll say we're looking at houses in the $500,000 range. Somebody could come in here and offer $650,000 for this property. But if it's a financed offer, that's not necessarily the strongest offer. The number sounds great, but if the bank doesn't agree and doesn't have the supporting data to show that it's worth $650,000, their loan is never going to get approved. So perhaps an offer that's closer to $550 with strong terms is going to be a better situation for that seller. Again, educating, setting expectations, realizing that your high offer number doesn't really mean that it's strong. Because a lot of people think, well, I'm offering them $80,000 over asking, why wouldn't they accept it? And then they also have no idea why the person from the bank hates them and doesn't want them to move into their dream home. So if you set the expectation that this is a third party who's coming in, this is not rocket science, they're going off of recent sales, and they're likely going to fall in a range. Now, why is that? You could have 4 appraisers come out and value the same property, come up with 4 slightly different numbers. And that's because when they go through and make those adjustments, if you're comparing a house that has 4 bedrooms to 3 bedrooms, you're going to add value for that 4th bedroom. And what they're doing on that appraisal report is making adjustments to make those recent sales as similar as possible to the one you're looking at. And from there, that end value is going to be roughly the market value. Making as few adjustments as possible is what's going to give you the most accurate representation of value. Now, there are exact numbers that an appraiser is going to input in there. So for a full bathroom, this price range, you're going to be adding $10,000 to $15,000. For an additional bedroom, you're looking at the same. For a half bath, $7,500. And there are numbers that are just input into the system. From there, part of that appraisal is going to be left up to personal opinion, which is why it's such a conversation topic of what's it going to come in at. Because we are all human, and that's why you could have 4 different appraisers come up with slightly different values. Condition and location are 2 of those terms that are left up to the appraiser's opinion. You can adjust up to 10% for condition, and where in that range they fall is going to be up to that personal appraiser. That means that if they're comparing a house that had a kitchen that was redone 5 years ago compared to one that was done this past year, how much value they add for that kitchen and overall condition of the house is going to be up to them. So when I'm educating a client before we offer, I'll state, hey, we're likely going to see that the bank has this much data to go off of and the appraisal is likely going to fall in this range. So if we're offering above and beyond that, which is likely what we're going to have to do to get your offer accepted, we want to tell the seller that we understand we're giving you a really strong offer and we're willing to bring forward a little bit of extra cash if the bank is not able to support the value we're offering. And that's an appraisal gap coverage. So you're just letting the seller know we understand this is the point where the deal could fall apart and this is what we're willing to do to keep this deal together and to move forward. Extra reassurance upfront. That's what all of this is. giving the seller as much confidence in your offer as possible. Depending on the buyer you're talking to, they might not have funds available to offer a $20,000 appraisal gap. You might be talking to somebody who has got a lot of extra cash. Phrase this part of the buyer strategy meeting dependent on your client's situation. If I'm talking to a client who only has an extra $5,000 in savings, $1,500, $2,500 still counts. And if you're being compared to offers that have no appraisal gap coverage and yours is at least $2,500, still better than nothing. I'll explain that at higher price points, this is very common to see in a competitive seller's market. Sometimes people offer no gap at all. Sometimes they'll offer that there's no limit. They're willing to cover any possible difference up to any amount, which I don't necessarily advise my clients to do. You could have an appraiser come in who's not educated about the area, and then all of a sudden you've got a really big difference that you've got to dig deep into your savings to cover. Find that number that you're comfortable with. This could be $50,000, $60,000. I'll usually say high numbers in my buyer strategy meeting, understanding that what they're comfortable with might fall a little bit below that, but I'm setting the expectation. I'd rather come down and meet them than say a lower number, give false confidence, and then we're in a situation where I'm talking to the listing agent and they're sharing that they have appraisal gap coverage at 50 grand. And I was explaining to my clients that you only have to offer $10,000. So rather than setting false expectations, I'd rather set the bar high and then figure out for each house that we're looking at, where exactly do we need to come in at. Through the appraisal process, we want that number to match up to your contract price. If it does not, you have 3 days to come to an agreement with the seller or the deal falls apart and you're able to part ways and get your deposit back. Sometimes the seller stands firm at the price that they agreed to. They're not willing to sell for less. Sometimes the buyer just does not have the funds available to cover any sort of difference. So you could either meet halfway, which is common. You might see a seller stand strong or a buyer just not have the ability to bring any sort of funds. From there, moving past that stage, that's really the next important, crucial detail to prepare your clients for. And I'll explain that inspections and the appraisal are the two ways to make your offer as strong as possible. And those are the two out-of-pocket costs. The appraisal is going to be between $400 and $500. It's ordered when you submit payment. So just because you send a text to your lender does not mean that it's been confirmed. Again, setting the expectations that this is something they're going to have money for available right away, and what it looks like to order it. What is the appraisal? Why is it important? How can we strengthen that term in your offer? From there, the next step is I'm setting expectations for how my client is going to act with their lender. I will explain that they're going to be asking for some updated documents along the way. The next step we're getting to is that mortgage commitment date. Any date that we have set on the contract has to be met unless both parties agree to change that date. So your closing date's a rough guesstimate of when you'll be able to close, but your mortgage commitment date, if you do not meet that deadline, you're not doing everything you can to meet that deadline, the seller doesn't have to give you more time. So I kind of give a little bit of fear in there of, if you don't make this happen and you're not on top of getting those documents back to your lender, then you might be in a position where your deposit is at risk. I don't ever want to be in a position where it's my fault that somebody's deposit is at risk. So I'd rather overeducate and set expectations ahead of time. During that process, as soon as the lender asks for updated information, you should be getting them those documents within a day or two, as soon as possible. Think of this way. Your lender is not able to start your file until they have all of your documents. So if they're waiting for that last tax document or pay stub, they're not even able to submit your file for the next phase of the process until they have all of that information in front of them. In the meantime, we're also going to be shopping around for home insurance. I'll be able to get you connected with a couple of my preferred partners. If you have a current provider, can't hurt to see if they can offer a competitive rate. This could be a great opportunity to bundle as well if you have car insurance and all those other things. From there, we have mortgage commitment, and that's really going to be depending on the timeline that you've set up. If you've got a later closing date, you might have some time to kill between then, but that's really the next important deadline. Very often, with a quicker closing, you'll be closing within a few days of this. And the next step before getting to that closing table is going to be your final walkthrough. That's done within 24, 48 hours of closing. And you're going to just make sure that the house is in the similar or better condition as when you saw it last. So there's no burst pipes. All the items that they were supposed to remove have been removed. All the appliances and items they were supposed to leave behind are still there and in good condition. This is a great opportunity where if you see something wrong, it's not the end of the world. I always phrase it to my clients as this is fantastic news. I've had a client within 24 hours of closing get to a final walkthrough and the basement had 4 feet of water in it. And they were horrified and scared. And I was like, this is fantastic. Isn't it better that this happened today rather than 3 days from now after you already own the property? And from here, now we have an issue. How can we handle it? And we were able to negotiate a really strong credit because the seller was already moved out, ready to close. So they're going to be far more apt to make sure that this goes through. And my buyers were able to get a whole new beautiful drainage system installed, and the appliances that were affected were handled as well. So phrase this as an opportunity to make sure that things are as they should be, but this is not the opportunity to be treated as a second inspection. So if you're going around and you're seeing that, hey, there's a little hole on the wall from this painting that was hung, and now if it's in the general similar condition as when you last saw it, that's what we're looking for. From there, within 24 to 48 hours, you have your actual closing. All of the offer documents before this can be signed electronically. That could be negotiations, your contract, any addendums. The only documents that are going to need a physical wet signature are going to be your closing documents. If you're out of town, this is something that can be overnighted to you and handled even if you're not local, no problem. We work with out-of-state clients all the time. It's very possible. We don't want to offer this as a point of stress. Something to note here, I do not recommend scheduling a moving truck for the closing date until we are much closer to, because depending on attorney's schedule or things that might come up and shift, this date might change a little bit. There is nothing worse than a client with a moving truck in the driveway and closing gets pushed 24 or 48 hours and they weren't expecting it. High stress, again, get ahead of as much as we possibly can. And this is a lot of information, has taken quite a bit of time, and you're probably boring your clients a little bit. And I get ahead of that. I say, hey, even if you retain 10% of what we just went over, that's fantastic. When we hit each stage of the process, we'll go into it in more detail, and I'll be able to answer any questions you might have. And we can also talk about how that step of the process relates to the home you're offering on. This is so, so crucial to have your value be explained up front. If you do not go through this and you don't have this as a part of your process, you're going to hit a point in a transaction or a working relationship with a client where they're not completely trusting in your ability to help them through. So going through the stages of the process, that's like step one. Now what else do you bring to the transaction? I have a few personal strategies and techniques that I have my clients do in certain situations to kind of get their offer to the next level also. Loan type, getting pre-underwritten, being able to offer a quicker closing. There are a lot of other strategies that agents are incorporating into their offers. Regardless, going through the steps, even if a client has purchased and sold a home countless times in the last 10 years, it's very, very unlikely that their agent went through the process like we are. And just as we're explaining this to a buyer, explaining to a seller what type of steps and objections might come up along the way is just as important. So we might find that a listing agent didn't educate a seller on the importance of the appraisal step. And now you're left with your buyer being educated, but the seller is kind of handling it as it comes, and it's far more stressful for them, especially in shifting markets where compensation has come into play and come into question. If you're not leading with value and leading with over-education, how are you standing out from your colleagues, from your competition, from the other 10 agents that your potential client knows in their sphere? There are many agents, and why should your client choose to work with you? At the end of this whole conversation, along the way, I've used assuming language. When we get to that point, when we are at the inspection, when the appraisal comes back, we're going to sit down, review it. We're going to have a rough idea of what that number is going to come in at because I've already done all that market research for you. I'm assuming that I'm going to be there with them. So by the end of this, they're hopefully coming to the conclusion that it'd be really silly not to work with me because I have the answers to the objections, I have the people, the connections, the team and support to help along the way behind the scenes. Why wouldn't they? And here's where I say, do you have any questions? And they're usually a little overwhelmed, but they might have a couple questions. And then from there, I'll say, okay, so the next step of us working together is going to be defining our working relationship. And I'll pull out the buyer representation agreement that I have with me, and I'll explain what that is. So this first part here explains that you don't currently have a signed agreement with another agent. Great. This next section here, I'm not reading this word by word with them. They will, and if you have a type A client, they will read it word for word. And you've got some clients that are like, tell me where to sign, I don't care, I want to buy a house. But tailoring your system to be very recreatable and consistent will protect you from an instance where somebody feels they didn't get the education on what they signed, which is not good, and which is why there have been lawsuits and settlements and debates, because clients are not properly educated. I don't want somebody to sign a document that they don't understand. And that comes down to the contract, buyer representation agreement, and anything else along the way. That buyer representation agreement, first part, are you working with another agent currently? Which means, do you have something signed? Everybody's talked to an agent. That's not what I'm asking. I want to make sure there's no other buyer-broker agreement floating around. This next stage here states that I have your fiduciary responsibility at heart. Anything you tell me stays between you and I. I will always use this example of confidentiality, because I'll use the example of, hey, if I'm best friends with the listing agent and you share that you have a little bit more wiggle room but you'd like to start here, anything like that, I'm not able to share any information that you tell me with anybody outside without your direct permission. So I'm making this agreement sound, which it is, like it is in their best interest to sign. Because why would they not want to define their working relationship? The next part here goes over commission or compensation. I try to avoid the word commission during a buyer strategy meeting. My fee is 3%. I don't have any out-of-pocket fees for showings or things like that. Some agents charge flat rates. I don't. Now, this compensation is sometimes contributed to by a seller. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes we might be able to ask for some sort of credit or something that would help you fold this into your loan. But this is my fee. And this is a statement. I'm not asking a question of, are you okay with 2.5%, 3%? When I talk to my clients, yes, of course, commission is always negotiable. And if they have any sort of pushback or objection that comes up here of, but my friend just bought a house and he only paid 2%. Okay. And you're not fighting your potential clients on what they're asking about. Yeah, absolutely. There's always, budget agents out there who are willing to do the job for far less. And you're likely going to see that as a direct reflection of the quality of service they bring. My clients pay 3% because I bring a ton of value to the transaction, and I have a really high rate of success in getting my clients' offers accepted. Would you like to work with somebody who has the highest chance of getting your offer accepted for your dream home? Or would you like to take a risk with the budget-friendly agent who probably isn't as educated and not using the strategies that I've talked about today? And they're gonna be like, oh, that doesn't make sense. Why would I wanna use the guy that doesn't know what they're doing? They're gonna wanna use the person who's just overeducated and overshared the value that they bring to a transaction. And how you phrase this part is going to be so, so crucial. Your level of confidence, your understanding of your value that you bring to a transaction is going to be apparent. People are going to read your body language, the tone of your voice, whether or not you're over-explaining because you feel like you need to handle an objection that they might have even said to you. You might be assuming that they have questions or doubts about the compensation that you're asking for. Don't fill in the blanks without reading the room. If you're getting pushback, handle those objections with facts and information. But if they're completely fine with paying for the service that you just explained, move on. Don't sit there and simmer on and over-explain a point, because then when you over-explain, it sounds like you're trying to cover something up or that you have doubts. So state your proposition, state what your fee is, handle any objections, and then move on. And the next page here goes over discrimination. We're not going to discriminate against any protected class, no problem. And you're okay signing things electronically. As I said before, the only documents you're going to need to sign in person are your actual closing documents with a wet signature. Great. And if they have questions or doubts, typically this is a pretty easy close at this point. If you've led with value and gotten to the point where they don't have any more questions, where are they doubting moving forward with working with you? I will withhold setting up an MLS search or setting up showings until I have all of this explained and signed. And I'll state this as, this is the gateway to get out and see houses in person. This is a part of my process. Again, depending on where you are in the country, a lot of agents don't use buyer rep agreements currently, whether their state requires it or not. Sometimes it's just a personal business choice. It's something that I've always incorporated into my business because it just makes sense. Why would you not want to guarantee that you're getting paid for the hard work that you're doing? Simple. And if you make it a part of your process that's expected and makes viewing homes possible, of course, if you're meeting an online lead, I'll bring a representation agreement and I'll fill in just that one property address. And how I'll explain it is, of course, we just met and we want to get to know each other to see if we are a good fit working together. I want to share that I have value and that they will want the value no matter what. And if we're a good fit, then it works out. Maybe I don't want to work with them. If you sound desperate, you will come across as needing their business. You have the value that they want. And how you portray your value and your image is going to be a direct reflection of how they perceive the authority and value you bring to a transaction. If they drove all the way to a showing and I didn't open the door yet, and this agreement is between them and what they showed up to get, they're probably going to sign it. They're not going to get in their car and leave. And I explained that this just protects that, makes sure that our insurance covers them, protects them, anything they share with me. We can make it just for this one property. This just means that if I were to help you move forward with this one property, that I would be compensated. Makes sense. If you phrase it as a question, they're going to be thinking there's another answer out there. If it's a statement of this is how your process works, any profession has a fee associated with services provided. What would possibly be different with real estate professionals? It just makes sense. From there, buyer representation agreement, easy, signed. You have done a ton of value. I will be careful of how much information about this process I share along the way. If I meet somebody in passing, I don't want to give away all my value because then why are they going to call me back? If I'm at an open house, what I might do is a very shortened version of this, give a ton of value, and then schedule that next appointment to go through it all the way with them at a separate time. If they mention that inspections are a pain point and they can't believe that people are waiving inspections, I will overeducate on inspections as kind of the teaser for what else we have going on. I'll state that, yeah, it's crazy. A lot of agents aren't using any strategies that are out of the box or anything like that to strengthen this, this, and this. And then they're like, oh, really? I've never heard of that. Or I'll ask, hey, if you've submitted offers 2 years ago, the last time you were looking for houses, were you doing X, Y, and Z? And if they're going, no, then maybe the agent you were working with 2 years ago is not the person you should be calling when you restart your home search this year. Education, value, all of this, if you lead with the value that you bring to a transaction, it's going to be a whole lot easier to get a representation agreement signed and to get to the closing table. The buyer strategy meeting is going to be the first phase of your working relationship with your client. You want to stay front of mind for their listings in the future. You want to be there for them with any assistance they need in terms of contractor referrals through the years that they're going to have living at their home. You want to follow up with invitations to your annual events, monthly newsletters being sent out, along with your personal follow-up to make sure that this buyer client is going to be a lifetime client and that you're front of mind as the real estate professional that can help them along the way.